Friends, on behalf of the Raza Foundation and the India Habitat Center, we welcome you this evening to the Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture. We organize from the Raza Foundation 8 annual memorial lectures. This is in keeping with our concept of plurality. There are quite a few memorable people who have left us somewhat recently, so we must remember them. And the idea is, of course, to create a mass of critical thinking about various disciplines that they represent. As you know, Daya Krishna was one of the outstanding philosophers we had. I was a very young student in Sagar University. He had joined as a young lecturer. Coincidentally, somebody who became Osho later, called Acharya Rajneesh. At that time he was not called Acharya. He was in any case a lecturer, so he couldn't have been called Acharya. So he was also there. And since some of us were trying to depart from the conventional mode of poetry, we're being treated as rebels in the university campus. And the literary establishment in the campus used to consider us as irreverent, which we were, and not very happily placed talents. Daya Krishna was one of them, the other one being Shyama Charan Dubey, who were two very young persons who supported us. And Daya Krishna has a special quality that he was deeply interested in literature. At that point of time, Daya Krishna was a well-known expert on Western philosophy. And he used to teach Western philosophy. In fact, in retrospect, I think I never suspected that he was so deeply interested in the Indian philosophical traditions, which turned out to be his major interest later. Anyway, Daya Krishna was a person who will not accept anything, take anything for granted. His was an interrogating mind. And many of us used to meet him quite often, and he'll be seated permanently in the evening in the IIC bar, and would have a number of people who would come around, including Nirmal Verma and others. So this is by way of a memorial lecture on him. We organize 8 such memorial lectures. They are in the memory of Habib Tanveer, Kumar Gandhar, Kelucharan Mahapatra, V.S. Gaitonde, Mani Kaul, Agge, Charles Toria, besides the Krishna. And we are very happy that this time the lecture is being delivered by a friend of ours, Ramin, Jahanbegloo, who is at the moment the Executive Director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies and the Vice Dean of School of Law at Jindal Global University. This might be the only university which can have a philosopher in the Faculty of Law. Otherwise, our departmentalism is so strong in the university that a person of philosophy would not be allowed, perhaps. The other example being Amar Sen, who, anyway, and he has received his BA and MA in philosophy, history, and political science, and later his PhD in philosophy from Sorbonne University. He had taught at the Academy of Philosophy in Tehran. Oh, he had done many things, including getting jailed in Iran, which produced
It's not a badge of honor, actually.
yeah, a badge of honor, of course, and resulted in a very fine book. Where is that? Time.
Say nothing.
Time will say nothing.
sure.
And his latest book is a series of conversations that he's conducting with some top-ranking intellectuals of the country. He had a book with a conversation with Ashish Nandi, and now is a book talking history, I thought.
They're talking philosophy, I did with Surabji.
Acha, okay. And talking history with Rumila Thapa. So there you are, and he's going to talk about the role of the intellectual in the age of Trump, which Edward Said famously said, the job of the intellectual is to speak truth to power. Now, increasingly in this country, just as the word secular is under constant derision and assault, the word public intellectual or the intellectual is also under constant assault. So we might have some lessons to learn for those of us who still have the pretension of being in the public domain and still deal with the realm of intellect and ideas. So Ramin.
Yes. Oh, the flower goes first. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. I thought the flowers go at the end, but they came first. That's nice. Anyway, thank you very much, Ashok Vajpayee, a great friend of mine, with whom I'm doing a book also. And I want to thank also the Raza Foundation. It's an honor to be here. I grew up in France. I grew up in Paris. Raza lived in France, in Paris. We never met, despite the fact that I knew a lot of artists and intellectuals. But I mean, this is a lack in my own private history, I think. So tonight I wanted to talk about the role of intellectuals in the age of Trump. It might appear to you as a contradiction because on the one hand is a person who very recently said that he wanted to pass an IQ test, being President Trump, and he was declared as a moron by one of his collaborators. And the other hand, we're talking about intellectuals. So, but I think that's the reason why I chose this title, The Role of Intellectual in an Age which is, I think, even worse than the medieval times, because I don't think that St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or other philosophers in the medieval times and late medieval times we had to deal with a person who's always, every day that you open a TV or radio, is present there. So that was a good thing about the monasteries at the time. At least you can go and keep yourself inside, and you can work on your treatise of philosophy or poetry as you write. Anyway, this is a text that I've written, and I hope that it's going to be quite challenging to you. So if you have the courage, stay until the end and come with your spicy questions, because that's what philosophy is all about. And otherwise, it's not worth lecturing like as usual. We do it in different institutions, and people after that leave without any questions. So questioning is very important. Now, when Thomas Mann, the German writer, he left Europe in 1938 to escape the Nazi terror and to settle in the United States, he responded to a journalist upon his arrival in New York by saying, this is a very famous word by Thomas Mann. I read it first in German and then I translate in English. Wo ich bin, die ist deutsche Kultur. Wherever I am, there is German culture. Today, if any of us here present situates oneself in Thomas Mann's footsteps, I mean to have a sense of humanism and critical responsibility, he or she has earned the right to say, wherever I am, there is human culture and a struggle for human dignity. But unfortunately, at the age of political demagogy and Trumpization of politics. This is what I created, Trumpization of politics. Things seem to be quite different from the time of Thomas Mann. The 21st century represents, in general, a separation between intellectuals and the public space. Seldom have intellectuals and the political world diverged so much. However, there is an ongoing debate within the intellectual arena on the model which can describe in the best way the role and identity of intellectuals in the public sphere. As such, intellectuals are no more described as superheroes of the mind, but simply as critical idealists who look beyond the scope of our everyday life. Today, critical intellectuals are an endangered species. Today's intellectuals have a fear of the political, and it seems as if the political has also a terrible indifference to what could be called intellectual, including India. Many others have seen this process as a decline of the intellectual. This decline is usually described as a process of distancing from the public sphere toward an increasingly professionalized, corporate, and managerial world. And in other words, intellectuals are losing their public authority and their moral legitimacy of speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power is what Edward Said and Chomsky said that was the definition and meaning of intellectual. While becoming incapable of carrying on their independent and critical functions as thinkers and animators of ideas. Never indeed critical consciousness and public sphere have been so profoundly opposed to one another. The move away of the intellectuals from the public sphere can be described as an effort to renegotiate the purpose and boundaries of the public sphere without taking into consideration the ethical imperatives of a dialogue with the political. As such, today's intellectuals seem to think that since all moral truths are relative, there is no more a need to represent a moral voice in a voiceless world. The attempts of the intellectuals in the academia and other professional institutions to pretend that it is politically correct and wise to be dismissive of moral imperatives in the public sphere is a way of coinciding the humanitarian urge of our world with the special needs of career making. Salaried, tenured, and pensioned, many intellectuals find themselves chained to the wheel of a respectable career and a profession which grounds their capacity of critical mindedness in a non-adversarial context. More precisely, narrow professional self-interests have destroyed the so-called public interests of the intellectuals. Quickly and unrepentantly forgetting their moral and political responsibilities, many intellectuals in today's world have degraded and abandoned the idea of public sphere, evolving into uncritical supporters of mass culture. It is by virtue of this uncritical publicness, I call it an uncritical publicness, because they become celebrities or pandits, they always appear on TV, but I mean, it's better, I mean, they have no questioning at all. So, by virtue of this uncritical publicness that political and cultural experts and media pundits have replaced intellectuals as the sociological actors of our contemporary world, engaged solely in discussing facts, i.e. facts dictated by the economic laws of the market or by the political decisions of governments around the world, today's media celebrities are no more interested in discussing values. The best example is Mr. Goswami, who shouts all the time but has nothing to say. So a loud mouth with a small brain. As such, with the rise of the post-industrial global village, dominated by media networks and technologized communication in which critical voices are often drowned, what can be called the epidemic of conformism has completely paralyzed and rendered impotent the critical questioning of the intellectuals. Even more discouraging is the disappearance of what the German Karl Mannheim had named in 1929 by the title of a socially unattached intelligentsia that would function independently of institutionalized concerns. It is, however, true that the intellectual has historically been imperfectly professionalized because the intellectual does not have a pre-established body of knowledge. Unlike an architect or a lawyer who build and sue for the clients, intellectuals claim only to be engaged in an activity of the mind. As such, intellectuals are individuals whose chief concern has been with ideas and the art of questioning. And by doing so, they have affected the ethical and political foundations of their societies for centuries. And that is the reason why, until very recently, intellectuals were considered as radical voices of enlightenment and emancipation. One can certainly write a history of intellectuals in the West and the East, but the category of intellectual remains nevertheless a problematic concept and difficult to define once for all. However, in order to question the role of intellectual engagement in the context of 21st century, we need to start with some of the salient features of the intellectual in history. It goes without saying that the intellectual has always been a social historical figure that has emerged from a cultural background, but with a public function that relates to a universal consciousness. And this emphasis on the universal task of the intellectual and his presence as a socio-political figure in the public space reinforces the distinction between intellectuals and academics. I make a distinction between the two. More often, we don't distinguish between the two. Moreover, with the intellectuals that focus, the focus is not only on the transmission of ideas, but with the act of universalizing awareness through a process of questioning. In other words, what I'm saying is that the critical mode of questioning, which is proper to the work of intellectuals, is an engagement with the problem of questioning itself, and not only the capacity to question and to doubt. I'm not talking about people trying to put questions, because we have to question the questionings, actually, or question the questions. That's the right thing. That's what Plato did, Socrates did. So the best example are lawyers who don't know anything about justice. They talk about law, but they don't know anything about justice. So if Socrates was there, he would ask them the same question he'd asked in the Republic of Plato: what is justice, Mr. Lawyer? Or Mr. Corporate Lawyer, who has studied with me actually at General University, or other people. So that's the problem. So perhaps the basic question of intellectual questioning is about the meaning, the validity and legitimacy of questions themselves. Why don't we ask legitimate questions? We usually talk about politicians. We never talk about politics. I'm sure that most of you here present, you don't know anything about politics. If I ask you what is politics, you will say Congress Party, BJP, Mr. Modi, and this and that. That's not politics. And so we have dismissed the right questions. Therefore, by definition, society for an intellectual is an active space of questioning and unlimited interrogation, in such a way that the question of freedom, justice, equity, and equality can always be posed anew and not taken for granted. So it doesn't come to us as a surprise that the history of political thought began with an act of intellectual questioning, that of Socrates, an Athenian philosopher and a gadfly, against his judges who condemned him to death. If Socrates can be considered as the first public intellectual, I consider him as the first public intellectual in the history of humanity, it is certainly because he is something other than a simple Athenian picked out of the crowd. He is an individual who takes his distance from his own heritage by questioning the nature of Greek myths and ideas. Socrates' main accomplishment is to call into question the conventional forms of authority and heteronomy in his time. As such, Socrates is not only a philosopher-citizen, he is a philosopher-dissenter, what we need today in India. Not only philosopher-academics, philosopher-dissenters we need. And the idea of dissent, this idea of dissent, is the key feature to the existential presence and epistemological attitude, I would say, of the intellectual in all times. Though the term intellectual as we know it today has been fabricated very late in human history, but the critical function of intellectual thinking and dissenting attitude of those who went against the tide has always been a mode of being disobedient minds throughout history. So you cannot be an intellectual and be obedient, because if you obey, you cannot question. If you obey, you cannot think. You only have opinions. But as many of you know, it is with the Dreyfus affair in 19th century France that the category of the intellectual became recognized for the first time, accompanied by a slightly different interpretation of his public role. Despite the ideological differences among intellectuals crystallized during the Dreyfus affair, both sides, right and left, they agreed that the intellectual should be engagé, as we say in French, engaged, politically engaged, publicly engaged. But what an intellectual like Émile Zola, the great novelist, saw at stake in the Dreyfus affair was to use his ideas as a way to denounce injustice. Zola's pamphlet, J'accuse, became the critical sphere of many writers, many artists, many journalists, many academics who jointly signed a manifesto. They called it the Manifesto of the Intellectual. Anatole France, Marcel Proust, just name it. Clemenceau, many of them. And they declared Dreyfus innocent and wrongly imprisoned on charges of leaking secrets to the German army. One of the intellectuals whose participation as a Dreyfuser influenced his entire life was the Jewish intellectual Julien Benda, best known for his work which is called in French La Trahison des Clercs, in which he argued famously that the duty of the intellectual was to defend universal values over and above the politics of the moment. So no flattering. Therefore, Benda conceived the intellectual as an individual who operates within a moral framework and adheres to transcendent values free of the impurities of politics. And Zola probably deserves that honor, not because only of his novels, but because he became an intellectual in the public sphere, attacking injustice, attacking prejudice, attacking intolerance. And in that way, he restored the function Socrates has reserved for the philosopher-citizen to stand for the universality of the quest for truth and to fight against violence. Socrates' method to tame violence was the use of dialogue against political persuasion. In carrying out his meiotic function, know thyself, as he said, Socrates was inviting the citizens of Athens to submit to a practical self-examination. Though an end in itself, learning to self-examine truthfully, but also critically, is also at the same time a precondition and a starting point for an intellectual to act decently. And I underline 3 times the word decent, or decent. Why? Because decency that most of us have lost in contemporary societies is a central component of human experience in ethics, but also an opening into human plurality as such, recognizing the otherness of the others. It is being hospitable to the idea, intrinsic to the work of a dialogical intellectual, that each person contains multitudes in oneself, as says Walt Whitman in his Song of Myself. Walt Whitman, the famous poet, American poet of the Civil War time. An intellectual needs such multiplicity as a device to connect to others, but also to praise and value the differences that exist among people as constituent of the world. So the idea of difference presupposes another value as essential to the intellectual condition, that of respect. As such, respect for other people and self-respect are main elements of an intellectual world, because an intellectual has enormous power to influence and change. He or she must be aware, and I'm directing this to you people, of the huge possible consequences of what he or she says and writes and does. You are responsible of what you write or what you say every day. Intellectuals are not only individual thinkers, but also public servants of humanity, who stand for something far larger than the discipline from which they have originated. It's not the diplomas that we have in our pockets which are important. It's our critical minds which are important. Either we have it or we don't have it. They are constantly balancing the private and the public. That is to say, an intellectual's personal commitment to an ideal must have relevance and respect for the society. This is how the intellectual engages himself with the changing issues of society while remaining true to certain ethical principles. So I don't want to name people here in India, which I knew that I met them 30 years ago in the UNESCO, who have done books on Nehru, and now they find themselves in the BJP government. These are not the type of people I'm talking about here. So this is how intellectuals appear as a moral conscience of their societies. This is because, as Albert Camus, the French novelist, actually says, an intellectual is someone whose mind watches itself. And I would add to what Camus says, intellectual is someone whose mind watches the world. This is the definition that the German philosopher Hegel gives for a philosopher. Philosophy is its time apprehended in thoughts. Philosophy is its time apprehended in thoughts. He doesn't say opinions, he says thoughts. And now I make the distinction between the two. One of the tasks of the intellectual is to think how to think, it's time. But can we think without disobeying, as I said, or without questioning, or without dissenting? The most thought-provoking thing about our thought-provoking age, Heidegger said, the German philosopher, is that we are still not thinking. Thinking is questioning. To think is to put the world and ourselves into question. In other words, thinking is determined by a person who questions. It involves not only our receptivity to freedom, but also the necessity to disobey. The call of thought is thus a call to freedom. There has been, since Socrates, the tradition of a public intellectual as the supporter and guardian of civic freedoms. So I'm going back to this tradition. I'm not going to the tradition of flatterers. What is important here is the work of self-examination and critical reflection as a way to protect societies from turning toward demagogy, populism, tyranny, and mediocrity. But it is also a way to protect intellectuals themselves from participating in forms of political and historical evils. The confrontation of intellectuals with the problem of evil in history brings me to develop more acutely the element of critical and questioning thought in public intellectuals. Who is a critical intellectual and who is not? By critical intellectual, I mean those whose works are cultural but disconnected from any immediate practical outcomes. The problem for such intellectuals is that their critical work is produced at the price of a loss of any immediate political effectiveness. As for practical intellectuals, on the contrary, they are engaged in some sort of social management in practical contexts without the possibilities of critical reflection on their political practice. And here we are dealing with two kinds of intellectuals, each of whom seem to lack what the others possess. So would it be correct to say that the first group of intellectuals make knowledge and values, and the other group apply it to political sphere? Or would it be more appropriate to consider public intellectuals as dominant holders of cultural capital who are also sociological actors of the public sphere? Well, involved in the cultural domain, public intellectuals have certain affinities of outlook and interest with those who are involved with political sphere, and it is therefore misleading to assume that intellectuals adopt a permanent oppositional stance toward the political realm. In 1945, in one of his first essays following the end of war in Europe, Hannah Arendt, the famous Jewish political philosopher, American-German, she wrote that the problem of evil will be the fundamental question of post-war intellectual life in Europe, as death became the fundamental problem after the last war, meaning World War I. I think what Arendt wrote in 1945 is still relevant for our time in 21st century, because the problem of evil and its political implications still present a major challenge to the public status and moral integrity of intellectuals in today's world. Intellectuals have always had problems with the question of evil, either as perpetrators of evil or as victims of evil. To accept authority has always been widespread, fierce, and politically effective among a segment of the intellectual class. But there is a sense in which intellectuals become traitors themselves. This is when they are no more in position to struggle against the inhumane because they feel too weak and to unmask its destructive tendencies. And the totalitarian ideologies, as you know, became a central symbol of this weakness of intellectuals to confront the inhumane. We had it in Germany, in Nazism, we had it with Stalinism, we had it with Pol Pot, we had it with ex-Yugoslavia conflicts, with the ethnic cleansing, and we have it today also. There are a variety of explanations for this weakness. First and foremost is that the European and North American intellectuals were not ready enough to confront the evil of multiple genocides in 20th century. They were really not ready for that. Some were certainly blinded by the lights of modern civilization and by promises of scientific and technological progress, but even those who were disappointed and shaken by the failure of modernity, they had put their faith and hopes in what the German philosopher Heidegger once called marvelous hands of Hitler. Most of you might know the story, you might not. Another famous philosopher, German philosopher who never collaborated with the Nazis, Karl Jaspers, asked Heidegger why you became a Nazi. You went for 1 year to the Nazi party. And he said, because of the marvelous hands of Hitler. He said he's a moron like Trump. Actually, Karl Jaspers said he's a peasant, he's a moron, he doesn't know anything. How can choose him as your leader? Say he has marvelous hands. So I say because of marvelous hands of Hitler. In the face of politics in the 20th century, European intellectuals became individuals whose lives and thoughts were characterized not by detachment to and critique of the inhumane, but by an essentially ambiguous engagement with it. For many of them, totalitarianism was an element, among others, in the mental landscape of modernity. And we need to be reminded that many of these genocides emerged from within the portals of modern and civilized West. By embarking on a career of political action and intrigue, many intellectuals, like Gentile, who worked with fascism in Italy, Raziak, Carl Schmitt, and many others, compromised their potential contributions to the formulation of a critical response to the ongoing crisis of modernity. I could add some artists to this list, like Furtwängler, Karl Orff, and many others. So, had they remained at their critical attitude, pursuing their critique of modernity, they might have understood the siren song of ideologies as a symptom of a larger crisis of modern intellectuals. In abandoning the critical reason for ideological politics, they effectively deserted their posts as critical intellectuals without being adequately prepared to think and to face the inhuman. So that's what I'm saying. Thinking the inhuman, which is still one of our responsibilities. One lesson that we might take with us from revisiting and rethinking the Heidegger syndrome, what I call the Heidegger syndrome, is that the forbidden marriage between intellectuals and politics may occasionally be preferable to the rigid separation between the two in order to make the intellectuals aware of the urgency of the inhumane in political praxis. The Heidegger syndrome reminds us of Plato's three famous unsuccessful voyages to Syracuse, undertaken in the hope of imparting philosophical wisdom to the city's tyrant, Dionysius the Younger. However, a good number of 20th century intellectuals disregarded the problems of pilgrimage to Syracuse. They willingly and openly served dictators like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and many other authoritarian regimes. And at this point, one can quickly arrive at a conclusion and affirm intellectuals would and could never succeed in turning tyrants toward democratic ideas, if we stay with this idea. Expanding on Isaiah Berlin's perspective, one can say that the dominant Western traditions, secular or religious, which have avowed an ultimate harmony of values through centuries, have constantly discouraged value pluralism. But whatever the political theories were and have become, the tradition of critical public intellectual, extending from Socrates to present time, has played a significant role, and not only in crafting it, but also in opposing its tyrannical destiny. Either as engaged academics, gentle animators of ideas, or dissenting social critiques, we have all of them in all sorts of people in this room, these categories. Intellectuals have always honored the specificity of critical thinking. The result is that the critical role of intellectuals and their political responsibilities are more difficult and relevant than ever. But let us ask, what public intellectuals should stand for and fight for in today's world? Passive intellectualism and intellectual elitism are both precisely what intellectuals cannot afford at a time when they are trying to bring together a global community of shared values in order to confront global challenges altogether. However, it happens that the specialization of intellectual life, together with the dominance of mass culture, have provided the disappearance of charismatic public intellectual figures like Jean-Paul Sartre or Camus, and the decline in the quality of what we call public. I think there is a decline in the quality of public itself. Today, intellectuals play no more the role of critical counterpower to liberal oligarchies and populist regimes around the world, as we can see it. And they have lost their ability to think independently without being an actor of the celebrity culture. As such, with the banalization of cultural life, intellectuals have been transformed into insignificant figures who find their homes in the universities and think tanks around the world, where they have no moral legitimacy in their self-disciplines. What's the most important for them is the salary they get at the end of the month. But public intellectuals are supposed to be the civil servants of humanity, as I said. And the burden of being a public intellectual and a civil servant of humanity is having the responsibility of transcending one's private existence and functional thinking to account for what humanity can become in its effort to maturity. For those among the public intellectuals who believe in the necessity of guiding humanity out of its self-incurred immaturity should feel morally responsible for the world of disaster and injustice in which we live. For many around the world, such an enterprise is not only a waste of time, but also a self-flattering, heroic action on the side of intellectuals. But, so, I think that this is, to conclude, this is an age that I call Trumpization of politics. It's an age of ignorance, it's an age of arrogance, and it's an age of mediocrity. Not only because we have mediocre politicians all over the world, which we can name one by one, but also because we have mediocre people who flatter them, mostly more than anybody else, you know. This is an age which has brought with it the rise of populist politicians and loud-mouthed demagogues around the world. However, the rise of the demagogues is the symptom, not the cause, of erosion of public trust and engagement. It can be said that citizenry is only realizable through active participation in public sphere. Therefore, divisive politics that pushes citizens into small bubbles and preaches fanaticism contributes to the decline of citizenry. But what is often lost in the debate is the role that needs to be played by the intellectuals as agents to transform the public discourse and move the society toward new social imaginaries and new mode of thinking. Certainly, as Edward Said once said, no one can speak up all the time on all the issues. But I believe there is a special duty to address the constituted and authorized powers of one's own society, which are accountable to its citizenry, particularly when those powers are exercised in a manifestly disproportionate and immoral war, or in a deliberate program of discrimination, repression, and collective cruelty. So, yes, this is a time for a moral battle against the inhumane in our everyday lives. And yes, this is a time, once again, for the public intellectual to be an uncompromising fighter on behalf of human dignity. Thank you very much.
Now is the time for questions or brief comments. The mic shall come to you. Just a minute.
Given what you have said, what accounts for this drift towards conservatism? It's because people look for practical solutions, like to take Mr. Manmohan Singh, our ex-PM, versus Modi, where people felt he was sleeping on the job because he was doing foggy thinking instead of something which was functional. Similarly, if you differentiate between Trump and Obama in terms of their role of tackling terrorism, in particular, Obama was pretty worthless in tackling Pakistan. while Trump has done excellent, is working in the right direction to tame them for faults which the Americans themselves caused in the first place. So what I'm saying is that, they talk about disruptive innovations. If you're going to be lost in thought and fuzzy fuzzy thinking or gray areas, there's not going to be any disruptive innovation, which is what is valued these days. Thank you.
Yes, your question, I'm going to answer it very bluntly to your question or comment. I would ask you to go and watch a movie which recently came out with this actress Salma Hayek. It's called Beatrice Dinner with Beatrice, and it's about an environmentalist who's invited in California to a party actually, and there she meets. She's a Mexican actually. She came and she lost all her family, and she has a conversation with one of these Trump people. Exactly somebody who is real estate and he owns everything he cares about, like a Walmart, manager or CEO, who cares only about money, not about the destiny of it. And what she tells her, and the guy is saying that, wow, I went to Africa, I killed so many animals, rhinos, I paid to kill animals. And she turns to him and says, you think that you will escape actually what you're doing, because you are going to die. If the world dies, you're going to die with it. If the world dies, you're going to die with it. Now, this is the problem when we see things small. And we start talking about Mr. Modi and Pakistan, or terrorism. Because terrorism is a symptom of a bigger thing, which I'm talking about. And every details of politics, Indian, Pakistani, Iranian, Syrian, that you read in the Hindu or the Indian Express or the Hindustan Times every day, they are symptoms of a bigger thing. And this is where it's the absence of people in the public space, is the absence of critical mindedness, is the absence of being blunt and speaking out loud against things which are happening in our world, and letting things happen passively. God damn it. I mean, how many years and ages we have to do that? Trump, I take the example of Trump, but I can take many other examples. He says climate change is not his concern. And today, America came out of the UNESCO. UNESCO is one of the most important institutions of the United Nations, maybe the most important. Because some institutions of the United Nations are really weak and are not doing anything. But UNESCO certainly did a lot in the past, I would say, 70 years, since the Second World War. And we know that when America gets out of the UNESCO, half of the budget is gone. People are going to be jobless, many projects are going to be down. And why? Because only Israel asked Mr. Trump to leave, because there were Palestinians, a delegation of Palestinians now at the UNESCO. Now, so what I'm saying is to see, in answer to your question very quickly, to see bigger. This reminds me of what Nietzsche said in Gay Science, if you go and read him. He said that if a snake does not shed, the snake will die. So the spirits are also, if the spirits, the minds are prevented from shedding and changing, they will die. A spirit which does not change and does not have the capacity of changing, which I call the questioning, it dies. So this is the problem which is happening in our world today. We have become spirits who can no more shed.
Is there
Take the mic, please.
Is there any special role which the intellectual performs which an enlightened and educated public cannot do? The other thing, why do you call this an age of mediocrity?
Yes.
Certainly it is an age of arrogance, but why do you call it an age of mediocrity? The thing which has struck me today, I read about the survey being done in an American university, and they got a lot of information from the public as contrast with the intellectuals. The public have thrown a lot of light on Trump's policies and what will be the impact internally and in the international sphere, which the intellectuals haven't been able to do. So how do you explain these things?
Yes, I mean, I use the word mediocrity because there is a lot of thoughtlessness and meaninglessness. And if I go back to my philosophy and Kant, when he says that humanity has to get out of his self-incurred immaturity, the problem with mediocrity and mediocre people around the world today is that they do not want to get out of their self-incurred immaturity. They find it very well. They find it politically well to be immature, and they find it business-wise very well. And they have representatives around the world, and they refer to their representatives. They say, well, didn't Mr. Trump succeed? He's a moron, but he succeeded. Didn't Mr. Erdogan succeed? He's a moron, but he succeeded. Didn't Duterte succeed? He can kill all the drug dealers, and he can be. So I will point out and say, okay. And they never mention people like Mandela and Václav Havel. Who do they mention? They mention the same people. Okay. So this is the problem. You know, I think that obedience today signifies somehow. Maintenance of mediocrity, maintenance of passivity, maintenance of conformity. No? So that's the problem. We live in the world of three C's: complacency, conformism, and conservatism. These are the three C's which are killing us. Neither secularism or intellectualism. Actually, these are not our enemies. But complacency, conformism, and conservatism are certainly our enemies. And we will see the results in 20 years from now, even maybe sooner.
Anybody else? Yeah. Then.
Yes.
Oh. Go ahead.
Good evening, Professor Ramin. If I could point out two important analysis that an intellectual does, that is reactive and proactive, that he looks into the past and the future. When he looks into the past, he sees an event and goes into the structural reasons which are not visible to the naked eye, so that those reasons, if they reoccur, that event can be prevented. That's a very valuable contribution intellectual does. But the other analysis that the intellectual does, that is his predictive analysis, when he looks into the future, there is an opinion within the intellectual community. There are people like Nicholas Taleb, the Lebanese economist, who say that in this kind of analysis, an intellectual's capability is not anything great than an average man, that it is not anything more than what common sense tells an average person. So in this domain, we should not take intellectuals very seriously, because as history has shown that they cannot predict things very well. So what is your opinion on this?
Well, my opinion is very direct. I'm not dealing with intellectuals as consumers who go to a drugstore and they buy their have their market. I'm dealing with them as courageous minds who have the courage of thinking against the times. And in today's world, there are many people who do not do that, you know. So I think that it's very important to, I mean, even intellectuals don't do that, but I mean, I'm talking about people who used to do that 50 years ago, you know, who could think critically. I grew up with these people, I know, and Ashish Nandi is sitting here, one of them. I don't want to flatter him, I hate flattering. But Ashish Nandi is one of the rare dinosaurs of this species I'm talking about. You know, dissident-minded, critical-minded, independent-minded, and he doesn't need to go and work for the government to come on TV and he's going to be read by future generations. So that's the problem, you know. I think that this reminds me of a French philosopher which I like very much, Pascal. He used to say, anyone who does not see the vanity of the world should be very vain himself or herself. So I would say, if we don't see today, and many economists don't see it because they only think in terms of economy or economics. My father was an economist, I can tell you that. He always told me, don't go and study economics, it's not enough to understand the world today. But, I mean, to see only the world in terms of statistics or the world in terms of the GDP is not enough. Because we see, I mean, things, we have terrible problems, that these are the problems of the mind, the way we think. And the way we think is reflected in our politics of every day, and is reflected in our the education of future generation, our children and our grandchildren, and is reflected in the climate change and the destruction of nature, which is taking its revenge on us with all these hurricanes and all these earthquakes. Because we have lost this idea of harmony, which is so important for you Indians. I mean, so many poets, philosophers, and social reformers talk about harmony in India. It's very important to be harmonious. And so we cannot become harmonious persons if we do not rethink our world and the place that we have in this world ourselves. I'm not talking in spiritual terms. I'm not a guru. I'm not an yoga teacher. I'm not talking at all in the terms that you hear every day and is part of your tradition. I'm talking in terms of thinking, which is so important. Doubting, thinking, questioning, renewing our questions, renewing our concepts, the concepts which we have found the habit of thinking every day. The concepts which are given to us by the newspapers, which are not enough for us to think about another world. So this is very important. Our conscience is deceived by the social and the political in today's world. It is deceived. So we have to go back to this work of consciousness.
So what is the value of predictions made by intellectuals? Is what I was trying
They
to
don't do
say.
predictions, but intellectuals are not there to predict. You know, they are not actually, you cannot ask the intellectuals to look in the globe and say, tomorrow you're going to live or you're going to die or the world is like this or like that. This is not their task at all, you know. Again, a story of my own private life, which has to do with intellectuals who used to be at a level which we are losing today. When I was a student in Paris in the 1980s, I wanted to do a book with Jahanbegloo. And the French asked me if you can do a book of conversation with him. I said, well, I've read the man, I know his work, but I've never met him. How can I find him? So finally, through Oxford University Press, I found him, and I phoned him, and I was privileged to talk with him on the phone. And he said, write me a letter. And I wrote him a letter, and now it's in the archives at Wolfson College in Oxford. And he said, he responded to me in a very funny way, which I'm going to respond to you. And he said, you know, my name is Isaiah, but I'm not a prophet. Don't ask me questions like, will there be a third world war? How is it going to be? What I want to predict about the future? This is not my job. I'm a philosopher. I'm not here to predict anything, you know? So, but his lesson for me is the lesson that I'm giving to you today. We are not here to predict. We are here to fight. But fight intellectually about the concepts we think, and how to rethink our reality, I would say.
Thank you, sir, for a very nice talk to us.
Thank you for coming.
after the Second World War,
Hold the mic.
after the Second World War, the biggest two nations population-wise are China and India. I don't think there is much of intellectualism or pseudo-intellectualism in China, but there is a hell of a lot for centuries the intellectualism in this country. Everything is questioned, turned around to find out where are we going. But I find India has got stuck with that, this pseudo-intellectualism, and hasn't progressed as much as they should, because they were very intelligent people once upon a time. And as you mentioned, that there is we are very average people, we are. And so how do we see our country, India, in this present world, as compared to the China? Is progress gone so far, and India is still struggling, and the people, the majority of the people are extremely poor.
Yes.
So why it has happened to that? Could you throw some light on it?
Well, there are several problems here that in your suggestion and your comments actually. First of all, I think that first of all, I just came back from a trip to China, and hopefully in India since the independence, they have not massacred intellectuals like the Chinese did during the Cultural Revolution, or they sent them to exile. It has not been the case in this country as it has been in China. Secondly, I think that India, and this is not something that you don't know, and I'm saying it to Indians, they know it better than I, who has not been born in India. Maybe I might be reborn in India, but not born in India. India has always been the moral conscience of humanity somehow, you know, with Tagore, Gandhi, many other people, Raza Krishna, philosophers, social reformers. And I think that India has lost that. Today, India is no more the moral conscience of humanity. Maybe because India has lost its, I'm talking from an insider point of view, from somebody who's living here and dealing with Indians, and I'm educating the sons and daughters of India. And when I see my students, and I tell them, what have you become? I mean, they don't even know their own history, contemporary history. I say, it's shameful. I mean, you've never heard of the name of Ambedkar or Maulana Azad or Abdul Ghaffar Khan. What is this? And you have never read a page of Amir Khusro or Ghalib or... So how do you want to defend your culture? And what is the point, actually? Well, I mean, the point is that they want to contribute to the GDP. But they don't understand that the culture of the country is more important than its GDP, because it's part, if it's not part of the GDP, it's even more important than GDP. So I would say it's a gross national culture more than gross national product, you know, or GMP, or it's gross national culture which is important. When a culture of the country is lost, and you know, when we say a culture or art in a country is lost, is when people don't take any more interest in it, and they take more interest in Tata industry, or they take more interest in consuming society, or they take more interest in how much money how much has. I think that it's very difficult to survive, and this is a time when prejudice, fanaticism, tyranny takes over. So the important thing is that I think that there are still many Indians as individuals, not as a group or not as a mass, not as a population, who can teach a lot to the world about how to look at the world. And let me make a point now from your question, a point which is very important. And I did talk about intellectuals, so I give you the impression that the only enlightened people or spiritual people are those who are urbanized, who go to universities and have diplomas. That's not true. I think that on some points, peasants can teach us a lot of things. Poor people can teach us a lot of things. And it's important to know. And I refer you to Zorba the Greek. And the story of Zorba the Greek, as you know, is this, in the movie, is this young British guy who is a philosopher, and he's writing a PhD in philosophy, and he goes to Crete, and he meets Zorba the Greek. And Zorba teaches him about life, about what is life, what is death, what is love, and also what is dancing. So there are many things that intellectuals don't know, but only their open-mindedness can help them to understand. The difference between, I would say, between a poet or an intellectual like Ashish and Mr. Trump or Erdogan is that the people like Trump and his entourage, they think that they all know everything. They don't need to know anything else from any culture, any artist, any animator of ideas. And because of that, what's the use? We can destroy them. We can destroy countries. We have the power of destroying. We can put menace on them. And we can take the budget out of UNESCO because we don't need education. Because UNESCO is all about education of children. Why do we need education? We have already what we have. Real estate is enough. Let them become all real estate, agents of real estate. And they will be like Trump's family. They will be rich and they will be happy. But we see what has become decency at the end of the day. Decency with Mr. Harvey Weinstein, the producer. No decency. Lot of money, lot of celebrity, lot of beautiful girls around, but the same beautiful girls come back and say, Mister, you're a very indecent man, I don't want to hear about you anymore. So, where is the fight for decency, I would say? And this is our problem today.
My question is belong to philosophy.
I hope I can answer.
Go ahead.
Kindly ask me to, human culture belong to public intellectual. How to?
Human culture belongs to public
intellectual. How to?
But human culture doesn't belong to human. I think that you didn't formulate well your question. Maybe you want to ask something else. Because human culture belongs to humanity, it doesn't belong to intellectuals. They can contribute to human culture.
Some contribute.
Yeah, they can contribute. And as I said, many people can contribute and do contribute. Artists contribute also, you know. And you can be in between being an artist and an intellectual, you know. Camus was a writer and he considered himself as the French author. He considered himself as an intellectual, as an artist. But what he used to say, I add to your question, he said, all creation is creating dangerously. An artist cannot create passively. A poet cannot be a passive poet. Otherwise, he or she is not going to be a poet. You cannot be a poet. You have to have the passion of the poetry. Okay? As a romantic poet, symbolic poet, Dada poet, surrealistic poet, any poet, realistic poet, a poet in the Communist Party of France, like Aragon and Éluard, but you have to have the passion for poetry.
Ask me to relate it also.
Do what?
asked me to relate human culture with public intellectual.
How do they relate to each other?
Only related.
Well, I'm trying to answer you. I said that they contribute. They can contribute to it. Yes, that's the main point. I mean, the main work of intellectuals actually to bring critical mindedness and to ask blunt questions and to actually make you think. I hope that some of you who go back home, you will take some of these questions with you. And tonight, and have nightmares or good dreams on questions. Anyway, thank you very much. And
Oh, thank you.
yes, thank you. Sorry.
Friends, thanks a lot, Ramin, for this brilliant lecture, which raises many questions, which all of them have not been raised here.
Yes.
But surely, as you say, we'll carry them with us, because you pointed out not merely to the mediocrity of the general situation of politics, but also mediocrity of public intellectuals.
Yes.
And that's an important thing to take into account. So thank you very much. Now our calendar for October. We are not going to let you rest in any sense. We have started a new program called Aram, in which we present young musicians, classical musicians and dancers. We are classical in terms of music and dance. So on 23rd, we are presenting Meenal Nathu from Mumbai and a Kathak by Vishwati. This will be in the CSOI and also in Triveni Kala Sangam. On 30th October, we have Art Matters in the India International Center, where Madhu Jain will be talking to V. Ramesh, the painter. On 31st, we are doing a half-day seminar on Urdu poet, writer and reformer, Altaf Hussain Hali, in the seminar hall of IIC. So those of you who are interested in any of these are most welcome. Thank you very much.